Let me, just looking at the overview of the uses that Wallace has, makes me want to say that an awful lot of stuff that really isn't tense use gets wrapped up into the traditional categories of tense uses. This has to do with speech act theory, and I think I mentioned speech act theory before. Have I?
Well, I don't.
Really? Okay. So, James Searles is kind of the father of speech act theory in America, and his work's been appropriated and developed in evangelical circles primarily by the systematic theologian who's currently at Wheaton. His name is Kevin Van Hooser. So comes into, although I have to give Grant Osborne in his hermeneutics text, The Hermeneutical Spiral, credit as well. Kevin Van Hooser, and in his book, Is There a Meaning in This Text? And Grant Osborne Spiral. Both address this to some degree or the other. My appropriation of speech act theory has been largely through Van Hooser, and in speech act theory you distinguish typically, okay, there's always going to be variations, but you distinguish locution, illocution, not location, locution, and what's called perlocution. Okay, a locution is what is said. An illocution is what is done by what is said. Okay. And a perlocution are, we can call it the consequences intentional or unintentional of what is said. Okay? So, here's an example. Locution. I could say the door is open. My illocutionary intent my intent is that somebody gets up and shuts the door. Okay. The perlocution is my roommate gets mad and yells, "Why do you always want other people to do your work for you?" Okay. Now, it was not my intention that my roommate get mad at me. So this was an unintended consequence of my locution. All right. Because language is multi-layered like this, simple statements are often analyzed by an audience for an illocutionary intent. We particularly look for illocutionary intent when we think that the locution is contrary to reality. Or it seems to be irrelevant. Why would a person state the obvious? Everybody can see that the door is open. There is no point in making that locution if the illocutionary intent is to inform the people in the room. It's an unnecessary locution. And since it's unnecessary, we assume then that the illocutionary intent is not to inform, but to perform some other speech act. Okay? Now, to relate this to tense use, the instantaneous present is often associated with performative speech acts. I hereby pronounce you man and wife. That is not intended as either an informative statement or, I guess that would be the only other option. It's not intended as an informative statement. What are you doing? I am pronouncing these people man and wife. No. It is, in fact, performing a marriage. And by making the statement, I pronounce you man and wife, in the very locution, we accomplish an illocutionary intent of joining in matrimony two people. Okay. And hopefully the perlocution is everybody's happy.
What's the difference between what is done and the consequences of what is said?
Well, maybe that's not the best way to write it down. What the speaker wants to do by what they said. Yeah.
So it's the intention.
The intention, yeah. So we talk about the illocutionary intent.
Is there something more than intention? So it's intention, but it also can be, it's a bigger category than just intention? Or is intention pretty much?
Well, like when I speak with the intent of informing you, maybe you could say, if you're informed, that's a perlocution. And that would be then the intended consequence. This is where I'm weak on my reading of speech act theory, so I'm not really in a position to finely nuance how the terms are used. I know they're used in the way that I'm using, but if further developments, I couldn't do that.
Yeah, I have one last question, well, for this particular part. So the locution, like, it's just what the words mean in and of themselves, or is it just, is it like...
The locution would be the semantics, the pragmatics, And conversational implicature starts to border on illocution. Okay, conversational implicature is how the larger context which may have no immediate bearing on the syntax of a given sentence, informs what's meant by that sentence. Now, just for example, let's say that we have been discussing in this class in abnormal psychology a person who's schizophrenic. Okay? And I look out the window and point and say, there's one. And the whole class bursts into laughter. Now, the semantics and even pragmatics of the sentence, there's one, are purely deictic. I just pointed out an instance of something. But the conversational implicature is that I'm assigning what we've been talking about to this person, and then that becomes the basis of a joke. Okay? And my illocutionary intent in saying there's one wasn't really so much to inform as to create a humorous statement. And if I have a person in the back seat who happens to be related to that person, I may get somebody mad at me, and I mean by perlocution, yes.
It'd be really funny if it's President A.
Okay. Now, let's apply this to the use of the future tense. I say, a virgin will conceive. Okay. The locution is a statement about the future. What's the illocutionary intent? Is the intent informative? I just want to inform. Or is the intent something along the lines of to make a statement which will be verified in the future and be seen as prophetic? So we call that I'm predicting something. And we don't. When we make statements about the future, we wouldn't say that all of our statements are predictive. Our illocutionary intent is not predictive in some cases. Like we may postulate, we'll use that word, or hypothesize that it might be that such and such, though we tend to shift out of the indicative mood into the subjunctive when we're doing that. So if I say that the difference between you shall study for this test, okay, that's not a prediction. My illocutionary intent is to command you, right? But that seems to me a little different than, for example, a culminative aorist, where I'm trying to portray, my illocutionary intent may simply be informative. I want to inform you, and that's the standard illocutionary intent for most locutions, informing. But I just want to inform you that the act came to a close. You know. Whereas it seems like prediction and command fall more into illocution, to a non-standard illocution. And so in that way, the tense is being used beyond the normal level of description, and we're actually trying to perform something. We're trying to cause something to happen. Okay. So you say to your, or let's say we have a television comedy where a man walks into the room where his wife's sitting and says, "Honey, you look beautiful today." And she says, "How much money do you want?" Okay? The humor, how much money do you want? Okay? The humor lies in working the difference between the locution, the two locutions, and the implied illocutionary inferencing that's going on here. Or he says, honey, you look beautiful today. And she says, I'm not going to do it. Whatever it is. Okay. So she got angry. He got a perlocution. So it seems to be completely disconnected from the locution. And in situations where we can't infer the connections, we say, I'm confused. Could you please help me? Okay. Which really means I don't understand how the locutions that have just been stated have any relation to one another. Now, this can be applied to tense use. This can be applied to... this is a part of, I think, an advanced understanding of hermeneutics. When we get a text, which is a form of locution, we're asking what's the illocutionary intent of this text. We call it the purpose of the text. For subsections of the text, we can seek to identify illocutionary intents. Paul says, you are kings to the Corinthians. And we say, the illocutionary intent is to shame them. He's using sarcasm. Because the Bible is a historical artifact, we cannot observe the perlocutionary effect of Paul's locutions. Though we have some sufficient historical connection points along the timeline to say, well, he's saying this later, then he said this over here, that suggests, or for example, in 2 Corinthians it says, what sorrow, what clearing of yourself, what zeal my letter wrought in you. So Paul is now describing for us the perlocutions of 1 Corinthians.
Would you say most, that maybe in a marriage, I guess, a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding is centered around
illocution.
Inferences about their illocution?
Yes. If you do not assume the best about another person's intent when they are making their locutions, you assume rather the worst about their intention, then you will there will be all kinds of perlocutionary problems. Okay?
That's another question.
No.
This one might be a little abstract, but is it possible to have a locution without an illocution?
All right. I mean, somebody has an exclamation. It's an involuntary exclamation. So you can have, but even that we are going to say has perlocutionary consequences, even if it didn't have illocutionary intent.
So if like a tornado picked up a big bag of letters and somehow a sentence was formed, still...
Yeah. It would be a locution, and it may or may not have perlocutionary consequences, even though there's no illocutionary intent, because a person was not behind it.
Yeah, I know. Your analogy like the matching of this. I'm trying to think.
I had the same question, Frank.
Okay. I find, I'm sure if Van Hooser were listening to me, he would have all kinds of qualifications and developments beyond what I'm saying here. But just this little level of appropriation has been really significant to me in discussing inspiration, for example. What was the illocutionary intent when God said so-and-so? If the illocutionary intent was not to provide a one-to-one correspondence to reality, but rather to provide a generalization, then you can't call it an error if it's general and not specific. Okay, so inerrancy must take into account illocutionary intent, the authorial intent, we would say it, behind the making of the statement. And let's say that Solomon's describing the circumference of the bronze bath. Was his intent to provide a down to the millimeter accurate, or was it to provide a generally accurate? Now we look at a crowd and we say, oh, there's about 200 people there. How many people were there? 200. And they count them up and say, nope, there was 188. You were lying. I say, no, I wasn't lying, and no, I wasn't wrong either. My intent was to generalize. Now, if there were 110 and I said 200, my generalization was off. All right. And even there, that's going to be a function of a culturally determined set of limits within which generalizations are considered accurate. So in our culture, we say that the number 5 is kind of the dividing point for rounding up or down. Okay, I suppose that's arbitrary. I don't know what I'm ignorant of what other cultures may have done in terms of determining how you round up or down.
Well, it seems like the bigger the number, the more off you can be, right?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, right. Yes. So when you get an account in Joshua saying that there were 22,000 and there were 23,000, and we say, well, obviously there's an error here, or critics say that, and we say, no, you have some number in between that can be rounded either way, and it would be legitimate to round it either way within that context. So it's a little idea that's really not that hard to get a hold of, but has had some really profound implications for my analytical skills in terms of text.
Question about sampling the other sermon, and I have given text, and like for the book of John, he gives an overarching theme. This is, I want you all to believe that Jesus is the Christ. Let's say I have a text that's not as explicit with the illocution. How would I go about discerning, say, maybe something from God? How would I discern illocution if it isn't explicit?
You can't always. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule. Context is the best rule for illocutionary intent.
And then taking from different books, everything, all the information would count with help.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. All right, so the future, Wallace, future offers an external portrayal, something of a temporal counterpart to the aorist indicative. It's viewed as a whole from the outside. With reference to time, the future is always future from the speaker's perspective, or when in a participial form in relation to the time of the main verb. Okay. It's very infrequent in participles and infinitives, so the vast majority are indicative. Now, having said what I said, it makes me wonder, let's go back up. Let's say I have sent Sam to deliver a document to my dad's office. And Brandon comes up to me and says, where is Sam? And I say, you will find him in my father's office. Since my intent is not to predict, but to inform, is that really a predictive future? And if it's not, what category does Wallace have to encompass that? It's like he doesn't have a category for that use of the future. And what I think he does is he subsumes it under predictive. which means then that there are genuinely predictive statements whose illocutionary intent was to predict, and there are informative statements about the future whose intent was not to predict, but still call it a predictive future, which I think is confusing. Okay. I would prefer to call, you will find him in my dad's office, a simple future.
Simple future, not even in the BJU.
Right. I hadn't thought this far when I was writing the handbook. Matter of fact, I didn't know anything about speech act theory back then. Okay.
You're not saying that absolutely he's going to find him, like it's going to come to pass. You're just giving information.
Yeah,
If I wanted to look for it.
yes. What somebody could ask in English, where will I find so and so? You will find him in my dad's office. We're talking about the future. Yeah. So I would prefer to limit predictive future to something where the intent is clearly predictive rather than informative. But I'm not going to insist on my distinction. So Wallace's examples here, she will give birth to a son, that's clearly predictive. Whoever drinks of this water will never thirst. That's really more of the informative variety. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon me, and you will be my witnesses. I think that you will receive power is predictive, and you will be my witnesses is really more informative. Jesus will come. Sometimes it's not going to be easy to distinguish. The one who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Jesus Christ. I think a lot of people view that as predictive, and because it's predictive, want to then insist, since the Bible is predicting a thing, it must necessarily come to pass, and then argue from there to a certain view of security of the believer on the basis of this text. Okay. I've never even thought about applying speech act theory to this use of the future. I've just always pointed out that in the context, Paul says in the very next verse that it's appropriate for me to think this way about you because you have participated in the gospel ministry. And so he justifies his expectation not on the grounds of the character of God, but on the behavior of the Philippians, which would then suggest that if the behavior changed, the expectation would change. The dead in Christ will rise first. That is clearly informing them about the future. And I suppose that could be viewed as predictive. The imperatival future is pretty easy. Though here's a case where, for example, I was talking with Dad about 1 Peter 1:16. You shall be holy because I am holy. And if you read that as a simple future, simply intending to inform, you're missing the illocutionary intent. Okay? If the intent is to say, well, you will be because I am. And of course, one of the ways that we can determine that is that when we look at the Hebrew that the Greek is a translation of, the form in Hebrew is intended to be a imperative. It's not imperative grammatically, but its illocutionary intent is also imperative, and it's the standard illocutionary intent for that form. And so that helps us then determine, yes, we do in fact have an imperative intent here behind the use of the He notes that the force of the imperatival future is emphatic. It's not There's a guy going to start practicing the piano, so if you wouldn't mind, please close the door, Peter. If you could close the door, please. Now, my locution was a conditional clause. Okay, if you could close the door, please. Okay, and when you want to play with the distinction between their locution and their illocutionary intent, you could respond to the semantics of the locution and say, well, yeah, I suppose I could, couldn't I? Okay.
I've heard a response like that before.
Yeah, and that's what we call being a smart aleck. We we label somebody who's a smart aleck when they're messing with the distinction between our locution and illocution. All right.
So whenever this distinction is relevant to the meaning of the text, it seems like it would be part of the criteria for determining the meaning. And then what would be outside of things that are normal in conversation, like tone, expression, things of that nature, nonverbal, what would be part of the criteria then to determine which illocution is being communicated when you just have words on a page?
All the standard hermeneutics, no special things here.
Just context.
Context, and all of it.
Flow, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And there's always room for ambiguity there. You know, the more you know about language, the more amazed you become that we communicate at all.
Kind of true, and yes, we do. I mean,
We do, yeah.
Everything we say is communicated. It doesn't mean there's not a miscommunication.
Right. So we can thank God that there's as much understanding that goes on as there is, rather than just living in a world of misunderstanding.
I have a question. I'm just struggling or while I was reading, I was struggling to differentiate an imperatival future and an imperative.
There is no difference in terms of the intent. Perhaps the imperatival future is emphatic, a little more emphatic than the imperative, although I'm not sure that that's the case. If I say, in English it works that way, right? If I say, study versus you shall study. You shall study seems to be like a power play. I'm imposing my will on you. Whereas study, so it's more emphatic. And it doesn't occur very often where it doesn't have an Old Testament background behind it. So it's been really hard for me to get any clear feel of how a normal Greek would use an imperatival future different from an imperative. And the grammars, Wallace is not a Koine scholar. He's not widely read in Koine and hasn't done grammatical analysis much outside the New Testament or Septuagint. So you end up leaning on classical grammarians like Smythe and his it's actually Smith spelled with a Y. And it's not necessarily the case that the Koine grammatical norms were identical to classical grammatical norms. So I'm not sure that I'm in a position to say how they would have used it.
It's just confused because my reading skills, I'm always looking at the beginning and end of the sentence or of a paragraph for the main points, and he starts out, Wallace starts out with this imperative future isn't identical, but then he ends with the Gildersleeve quote that, but it's not a milder or gentler imperative. I'm like, okay,
well, you have
similar.
Yeah, but you got to read the middle of the paragraph.
Oh yeah, sure I do, but I'm just saying, after reading the middle of the paragraph, I highlighted the beginning and end, and I guess I did
but even when the Old Testament is not behind the command, the force of the imperatival future is emphatic. That's the key sentence.
I have that underlined as a key sentence, but I guess it didn't help me. I knew it was important, so I underlined it, but I didn't quite understand.
Okay, so are you clear now?
Yeah, I think I'm good, yeah.
All right. Deliberative future asks a question that implies some doubt about the response. Shall we not? The gnomic future. The future is very rarely used to indicate the likelihood that a generic event will take place. The idea is not that a particular event is in view, but that such events are true to life. In the gnomic future, the act is true of any time. I take it that's a quote from Fanning?
What's Robert?
Robertson. Yeah. Okay, so I think that kind of supports what I had said earlier about the nature of the gnomic. Miscellaneous subjunctive equivalence. Future indicative is sometimes used in situations that are normally reserved for the aorist subjunctive. We've seen this with the deliberative future. Other categories include emphatic negation. Ume plus the future indicative is emphatic. Now, my favorite verse for that is Galatians 5:16. Walk in the Spirit, and you shall by no means fulfill the lust of the flesh. Ume plus the now, suddenly I wasn't sure whether that was indicative or not. So that's not a good example, is it? Yeah. No, that's the subjunctive. So scratch. That's ume plus the aorist subjunctive. Let's find an example of ume plus a future indicative. Okay. Peter took him and rebuked him and said, this shall not be to you. This shall never happen to you. Okay, so ume estai su tuto. Or Mark 13, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word ume paralusantai will never pass away. So, good. All right, perfect tense. Running out of time here today. So why don't we go ahead and stop here and pick up here the next time if it's needed.